Hello friends, and welcome to a new episode of Reality Check. Our age is dominated by the ephemeral and the transient. Cultural deconstruction runs rampant, and a looming nihilism seems to engulf all meaning and existence itself. Yet the transcendent still manages to break through. Here at Reality Check, we inquire how to conserve the real in a time of deconstruction. Today we want to take a deep dive into the rich and intricate world of the Roman Catholic liturgy. What is the current situation of the old rite, the extraordinary form, as Benedict used to call it, or plain and simply the Latin Mass? What kind of persecution, even from the ranks of the Vatican itself, is it undergoing, and what is its likely future? In addition, I want to examine the broader cultural significance of the liturgy, from shaping religious identity to influencing spiritual practices and cultural traditions. The liturgy plays a pivotal role in the Catholic experience in establishing and shaping culture. For that sake, I'm delighted to be joined by Gregory DiPippo, a distinguished scholar, liturgist, and native of Providence, Rhode Island. Gregory has a diversified academic background, having studied Latin, Greek, and several other languages, as well as classics and patristics. He has been a regular contributor to the new liturgical movement since 2009 and has served as its editor since 2013. His extensive writings cover a broad range of topics, but he first gained prominence for his study of the reforms of the Roman liturgy before the Second Vatican Council, on which he has authored several influential series of articles. And I may add from personal experience, I know that his knowledge of historical roots of liturgical symbols and forms is truly unparalleled. So welcome, Gregory. I'm happy to have you.
Very glad to be here. Thank you so much.
Now, first things first, maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself and what sparked your love of the liturgy, specifically the old Latin Mass, and why did you end up living in Rome for a large part of your life?
So I was raised a Catholic in actually the most Catholic state in the United States, Rhode Island, in terms of the percentage of population. And my parents, who were both born in 1942, loved the old liturgy and were not very content at all with the liturgical changes that came in after Vatican II. And so they had kind of prepared me. It wasn't like a sort of propaganda campaign, as it were, but they often mentioned how much they missed the Latin, how much they missed the chant. In the 1970s, in most of the United States, the liturgy was celebrated very badly. Rhode Island was not an exception to that at all. So, but I mean, we really thought that these things had just disappeared entirely from the world, more or less. And so, in 1995, I went to Rome to do an 8-week course of studies with a very, very famous Latinist, the late Father Reginald Foster, one of the greatest Latinists of our times. And I discovered the traditional Mass when I went there. And it was a real eye-opener. It was the first places where I really heard Masses sung with Gregorian chant. I knew Latin fairly well, and from my studies with Father Foster, I came to know it even better. So that was sort of enabled me to sort of appreciate it a little more deeply, I would say. And my studies of the Church Fathers wound up making it clear to me how very deep and ancient the roots of the historical Roman liturgy actually are. So my whole educational background kind of helped that. I did classics as an undergraduate, and I was extremely well trained in that I had fantastic teachers. So that also, was a very useful tool for engaging with the Roman liturgical tradition.
It's a good combination, right? Studying classics and then seeing Latin in action. I've heard this from many people. It's nice to realize that Latin is not as dead as many people make it out to be.
No, not at all. Not at all.
What brought you to working with the new liturgical movement? So it's a really interesting website, and I invite all of our viewers to visit it. It has a plethora of articles that have been collected, as we said in the introduction, for multiple decades now, kind of tackling different issues with the liturgy, but also giving historical background to many of the liturgical practices and customs. How did you get involved, and was it helpful to live in Rome and to kind of experience the more elaborate liturgies there for your writing?
Oh, well, no, absolutely. I mean, Rome really showed me the tremendously deep connections between the liturgy and the city of Rome. I mean, all historical traditions, historical liturgical traditions, the Roman Rite, the Byzantine, the Ambrosian, whatever, are deeply rooted in place. So there are features of the Roman liturgy which are specifically connected to a particular church or a particular historical event in the life of the city of Rome. This is, as I said, also true of very much of the Byzantine Rite. So yes, living in Rome certainly taught me a great deal about that. So in terms of Sure. Well, for example, there's a series of we have one of the most interesting features of the Roman Rite historically is what they call the station masses. There are a very large number of days. Most of them are in Lent, but not all of them. And there are really interesting literary connections between specific masses and the specific churches in which they were celebrated. So just a very simple example is that the stational mass of Easter Sunday is at the Basilica of St. Mary Major. And it's part of a whole arrangement of stations which kind of go in order. So first you have the Virgin Mary, and then you have Peter, then you have Paul, then you have Lawrence, and then all the apostles, all the martyrs. So Easter week is a celebration of the whole hierarchy of saints and everything that Christ did with and through the hierarchy of saints subsequent to the resurrection. So, but I mean, you could write an encyclopedia about just the station liturgies and their connection to the literary text. So.
That's fascinating. So then every one of those saints has a church dedicated to him or her.
So I mean, the station churches are dedicated to saints, or Christ. So some of them, the Church of the Holy Cross is not dedicated specifically to a saint, but there are, the Church of the Holy Cross, where the relics of the Holy Cross are. That's where the station is on Good Friday. So there's many different connections of that sort. So
makes sense. Go ahead.
I'd come to know a fair amount of that. And the way I got involved with New Liturgical Movement, it was actually founded by a Canadian fellow called Sean Tribe, who came to Italy, met me and a whole bunch of other people. He might have met you at that point. I can't remember if you were in Rome already. And so, and he invited me to start writing for them. So I was actually in my early years very, very slow writer. There were like gaps of months in my archives.
We all were.
But then when Sean decided to retire in 2013, I felt that the mission of it was important enough to take on the work of being the full-time editor. So now I do the largest part of the writing, and just in terms of the number of articles. We have a number of other collaborators. So,
Very nice.
Yeah, it's been 11 years.
You've sent me a good bunch of the links for many of them, because many questions do arise, especially when discussing the Lent Mass. So it's a very, very rich treasury of insights, liturgical and non-liturgical. Well, we are kind of blessed because we are the generation that have experienced Benedict XVI, specifically his reform, attempted reform of the reform anyways, and the revival, effectively the institutional revival of the Latin Mass through him and through the various documents Summorum Pontificum, obviously, as the prime one, but then also some minor documents as well. It does seem that the pendulum swang the other way now under Pope Francis. Not just that there is no more support from the Vatican, but indeed there seems to be some kind of suppression. Would you share that? Would you share that perspective? And also, could you maybe give us a little bit of an insight what the situation is in general with the Latin Mass right now in the Church as it is practiced after the pivotal document Traditionis Custodes by Pope Francis?
Yes, well, I would say that Summorum Pontificum was one of the great successes of Pope Benedict XVI's pontificate. It was the fruit of his very, very long and considered meditation on not just the liturgical problem, but the whole slew of problems that afflicted the Church after the Second Vatican Council. And to a very large degree, and I cannot emphasize this point enough. This is a point that is made in bold caps and underlined and italic. That
with an exclamation point.
And with many exclamation points, with an inappropriately large number of exclamation points, that the problems of the Church today come to a very large degree from the rejection of the Second Vatican Council by the Church on an institutional level. So the liturgy is what it is today because what the Second Vatican Council said about the liturgy in its very first document, Sacrosanctum Concilium, was not heeded. So Pope Benedict was deeply, deeply aware of this as a problem for the Church and of the profoundly damaging consequences of this problem to the Church. So, Summorum Pontificum was the result of his very, very long and considered meditation on this. And his remedy for it was simply to say, to recognize certain fundamental truths, one of which is simply that the post-conciliar liturgy is not the result of what Vatican II asked for. And along with that goes that the post-conciliar liturgy wound up being the repudiation of an enormous amount of the Church's history, an enormous amount of its patrimony. Patrimony of written text, patrimony of music, patrimony of art, so all things which he regarded as extremely important. So it was his attempt to make sure that that patrimony continued to live and breathe and inform the life of the Church. So Traditionis Custodes, which was the revocation legally of Summorum Pontificum, has, on the other hand, turned out to be a failure, in that it is essentially a fellow from the fellow who writes for National Review, Michael Brennan Doherty, summed this up, I think, better than anyone could ever sum it up, which is he said that Pope Benedict was right because his arguments were the result of profound theological consideration, and have proved to be, as things go on, true. And Pope Francis was wrong because the argument that he made was the sociological argument, which was wrong when he made it, and has proved to be wronger as things go on. It hasn't really persuaded anybody of anything that they didn't already believe. Nobody has come to believe that the traditional Roman liturgy should be put in the dustbin because the Pope said, here's my plan for putting it in the dustbin. And nobody, in a way that I don't think is true of Summorum Pontificum opened the eyes to a lot of people as to why the liturgical patrimony of the Church needs to be preserved. There are many, many, many stories that one could find quite easily of priests saying that celebrating the old Mass taught me how to celebrate the new Mass better. So So in that sense, I don't believe that it's actually going to have the long-term impact that Pope Francis wanted it to have. It isn't going to cause the old liturgy to disappear.
Okay, so but what is if the suppression goes? I mean, just today I spoke with a visitor from Washington, and he pointed out that that where he lives, the old mass cannot be celebrated anymore. So it was moved, to my knowledge, in Washington to a Franciscan monastery because it's not a diocesan church, which now gets experiences a revival in participants. Surprise, surprise. Yes. But I mean, well, what will happen? I mean, it sounds like what the Pope is doing, the path that the Pope is choosing to go down, will effectively lead to some sort of schism, some sort of actually deepening of separation within the church, whereas the liturgical peace that Benedict had in mind brought a real unity and a real coexistence effectively in parish churches and also just in the larger life of the church. Like, would you agree? What do you see? I mean, do you see the restrictions becoming even stricter than as they are now?
It may be so for a time, but the generation of people, which includes Pope Francis, who see the old mass as a problem, is not much longer for this world. I mean, right now, Pope Francis is older than all but 5 popes in the entire history of the church has ever been. It's clear that he is not in particular. It's clear that he is not in particularly good health. I mean, he's clearly going up and down. Sometimes he sees much better than others. So, but regardless of him, the number of one of the essential contentions of Traditionis Custodes was that the bishops of the world had been pleading with the Vatican for the authority to crack down on the continued use of the traditional liturgy. This contention has been revealed to be fundamentally false because so few bishops, not none, and unfortunately the Archbishop of Washington was one of them, but very few bishops actually cracked down. So to the point where the Vatican then had to do a major end run around canon law and issue a formal rescript to change canon law, or change an aspect of canon law, in order to force the bishops to do the thing that they said the bishops very much want to do. So, and so in the short term, yes, unfortunately, there will be a sort of slow attrition of traditional masses, and more of them will close down. Some that will be forced, but it isn't convincing anybody that that is what actually should happen. And when there is a shift in the wind, as there will be, Traditionis Custodes will be revoked, and permission to celebrate the old mass as part of the church's patrimony, as Pope Benedict envisioned, will be restored.
Can you elaborate a little bit on the canon law bit there that you just mentioned? I'm not sure that many people are aware of this. So, what happened with the changing or the?
Yeah, there's a specific provision of canon law, Canon 87, which says that bishops are entitled to dispense from universal laws when they deem that it is good to do so for the benefit of their specific diocese. And many bishops who, said, the essential contention of Traditionis Custodes was that you have this sort of coven of false conversos within your diocese. So go thou establish an inquisition against them. And a very large number of bishops said, no, my trads are great. We have really nice trads. I like them a lot. And issued some sort of formal decree saying we are not changing anything about how the traditional mass is done here. And so the contention was then made on the part of the office that regulates this in the Vatican, the Dicastery for Divine Worship, that you can't apply Canon 87 to that. And the response was, why not? So the cardinal who is in charge of the dicastery for divine worship. Oh, and let me emphasize, this is all a matter of public record. I'm not telling you any tales out of school. The cardinal who is in charge of the dicastery for divine worship, an Englishman named Arthur Roach, then got a special rescript from the Pope saying, in order to issue this particular class of exemptions, you cannot do that of your own initiative. You must apply to us for that exemption, and Canon 87 does not apply. But again, if it were true that the bishops had been desperately pleading with the Vatican for authority to do this, why did the Vatican have to do this end run around canon law in order to make them do it?
And also it seems to have two effects. One being that the bishop is effectively robbed of some authority that especially the Second Vatican Council would always be emphasizing, right? The role of the bishop. And then the second is a centralization of power in the Vatican. In a negative way. Some centralization, I think, would be necessary, but this would be a more a centralization of power where there should be subsidiarity. So
yes, 100%. No less a figure than George Weigel, who is not known for his sympathy towards the traditional liturgy. I mean, he has spoken out against this quite forcibly, and he said, this is in direct contravention to what the Second Vatican Council says about the authority and position of the bishop within his diocese.
One of the real questions I feel that came up after Summorum Pontificum, so during the pontificate of Benedict XVI still, and somewhat still lingers, is, well, there some elements of the old mass, of the Latin mass, really should be modernized. And I'm thinking specifically, I mean, arguments that come up specifically that I can sum up, or that I can conjure. For example, the kind of the poverty of reading for priests during the week, so that the Sunday Gospel is always repeated if there's not a special liturgical season. Another one would be obviously the incorporation of new saints, right? New saints. I mean, the church is a living body. She lives in time, and there are new saints being canonized, every year, or at least regularly.
Very often.
So those obviously, many may say too many of them, but nonetheless. But those kind of modernizations should also affect the old rite. I mean, do you actually see a possibility for something like that in the future, especially since the status quo basically now is just a liturgical war and a suppression of the old rite and the war between the new and the old rite? So do you actually see that there could be a fruitful, modernization, for lack of a better word, of the old rite? Or do you feel like that should really be put on the back burner also for caution's sake, and that will not happen for many decades? Well, what's your take?
For caution's sake, it should be put on the back burner. Whether that would be decades or a decade or decade and a half, time will tell. It is certainly, I mean, right now, no. I mean, that just can't be done, because if it were done, it would be done very, very badly, very, very badly indeed. I would say that these issues would need to be sort of examined one by one. In regards to updating the calendar of saints, for example, very shortly, before, like a year and a half before Traditionis Custodes came out, a specific concrete step towards modernization of the calendar, updating of the calendar of saints, was actually made. Decrees were issued in March of 2020, that most fateful of months, which did actually begin a process by which new saints might have been incorporated into the traditional liturgy, and also to do something which Pius V did, which is to at least trim back the feasts of saints who don't really necessarily need to be on the general calendar. But the lectionary is a very, very different creature. There have always been updatings of the calendar, but the lectionary of the post-conciliar rite is what it is, again, in almost total defiance of the words of Sacrosanctum Concilium, and as a thing which was created by professedly throwing out the historical lectionary of the Roman Rite and saying we are going to take no account of that and create something new. And I can actually show you the minutes. I have them in my computer, in which the people who created the new lectionary said that. What would need to happen is that we would need to have a pope with the honesty of Pope Benedict about the nature of the liturgical problem and enough courage to say we need to start addressing these problems. So about how the new lectionary does not meet the requirements of what Vatican II asked for, and its intrinsic problems, the way readings are censored, the abandonment of the Roman temporal cycle. I mean, there's there's a whole bunch of other problems that we need to be addressed before we could talk about bringing the two forms, as Benedict called them, together.
So, but that would, addressing those problems would effectively also warrant a reworking of the new form, of the ordinary form of the new mass, right?
Certainly.
Yeah. Yeah, very, very interesting. I have so talking with tradition lovers, if we can call them that. I try to avoid the isms, but let's say traditionalists in an amicable way. Oftentimes, an argument that I've seen is really the little bit of an anachronism. So, okay, what do I mean by that? The people who are not really understanding those who want to go to the Latin Mass and who may not be aware of the riches of the Latin Mass, and also that the Latin Mass was the kind of cornerstone of the church's life for, at least 1.5 millennia, probably more. They often say that the old Mass is an anachronism. And that seems to be fundamentally what Pope Francis says in a nutshell. If you see his speeches or the comments that he makes, even offhand or off the cuff, on the Latin Mass, he says, well, this is just something that is somewhat elitist. A bunch of crazies go to this and go to this event, this liturgy, and ultimately it is something outdated. And what we need to do is we need to educate these people to understand that it is outdated and that they need to go with the times. Okay, I'm obviously vastly generalizing here, but more or less that seems to be what the vein in which Francis is arguing. One of the things that I've realized, though, is that, well, if you pick a moment in time where you say, okay, well, back then the liturgy was still okay. So let's say Summorum Pontificum that codified the 62 Missal. Well, others would say, well, no, we actually have to go back to the, pre-55, pre-Pius, the 12th reforms. And then somebody else may say, well, actually, we need to go back to the 19th century. And then somebody else would say, well, actually, we need to go back before the French Revolution. So I feel like my worry is that if you pick a certain time in the past where you say, okay, well, this is where it was still pure, or this is where it was still pure, then you just basically outbid yourself by going back and back and back. But there is no more criteria on well, when was that point where the purity really was true? And I would say, more as a philosopher here, not as a church historian or a theologian or liturgist, I would say, well, that purity really never did exist. There was no point where we could say, okay, well, this was the liturgy at its most perfect. It always underwent changes, and there were always new uses and new customs introduced, and then some other customs died out, right? So now this is a complex question, but with all of your experience and certainly all of your very intense studying of the subject, what would you say, maybe this is then the question being, well, what distinguishes true and false tradition, and this is correlated, does use, so custom, plain and simple, make tradition? Because something has been done at some point, it has become tradition. How do you tackle this?
Okay, well, first of all, I say no, the correct point, the point is 1376. No, I'm just kidding. So,
very good. Okay, well, then we can move on.
1376 1376 is when the popes moved back from Avignon to Rome, which did actually bring about a change in some of the aspects of the music that was done in the papal court. But no, in all seriousness, it is true that there has been a certain evolution of liturgical form in all rites, including the Roman rite. But that needs to be balanced by an assessment also of a very, very notable continuity that is also present through all of those evolutions. So that, and so you can take a particular feature, say, just grabbing random because it's one I've studied a great deal and I'm very well versed in, which is the oldest lectionary of the Roman Rite. It's actually not a lectionary in the sense of a collection of, it's not a book full of readings that you can actually sing the epistles and gospels out of. It's just a list. Okay. So this day, read from this book, start here and here. So it's called the Würzburg lectionary. It should be more probably referred to as the Würzburg capitulary. And it was copied out about the year 650. I'm copied out about the year 700. It represents the sort of status of the Roman lectionary in about 650. It is manifestly the basis of the same lectionary that you have in the Missal of Pius V, which is 900 years later. So that is true. And then you only have to get to 100 years where you get the next one, which is the Murbach capitulary. The Murbach capitulary, obviously, it doesn't contain later feasts like Corpus Christi. And there are some differences, to be sure, but essentially the Murbach capitulary is the lectionary of Pius V, 800 years before Pius V's Missal came out. So that kind of continuity is present in all of the different features of the Roman Rite as far back as we have records. So in terms of the new rite, this is the post-conciliar liturgy promulgated by Paul VI, I think just as not as a matter of polemics, I think just as a matter of simple assessment of text. The Missal of Paul VI breaks that continuity because there are things which are consistently present in all sources as far back as we have them, or in the majority of sources, the vast majority of sources, which were changed. So sometimes changed by having the text altered, sometimes having it deleted. Customs which we know were consistently used in all forms of the Roman Rite, which were gotten rid of, the single canon, for example. So, and so I think that it's really sort of important to understand that. And again, Joseph Ratzinger identified this. He said that the problem of the new Missal is that it represents a radical break in continuity, which is simply unprecedented in the history of liturgy, not in the history of the Roman liturgy, in the history of Christian liturgy from the beginning. So, and so having established that principle, I wouldn't honestly say that there is any specific missal, the 62, the 55, the 1913 typical edition, Pius V's edition. I think that it is simply the thing which the church needs to do is look at each individual feature, assess the value of any specific feature. And I really believe that in doing so, we will, in the balance, come up with saying that we should maintain the things that stand within that vast continuity, and not just because they are in continuity, but because they were created by men of profound faith, profound spirituality, and profound literary sensitivity, which we simply don't have in our own time. So if I were to compare it, it would be what was done in the 1960s would be very much like if you were to take some modern novelist that writes the kind of, garbage novels that you buy in airports and have them rewrite Shakespeare. That's what we have.
Would you say that the lectionary then is the backbone of the missal?
No, no. It's one of the most important features of the missal. I chose that because it's a thing that interests me a great deal, and I studied it very, very much in detail. You
Well,
can say
but I think, yeah, no, but I think that this is something intrinsically fascinating, though, because the question would really be, and maybe what's your assessment there? That'd be interesting. How did the Würzburg list of readings, that's the capitulum, as you said, if
capitulary.
I get this right? How with what kind of how was that compiled? Like, what was the reason behind that
Oh, it was
specific?
copied from Rome. It was copied from Rome. It was what they were already doing in Rome. So the physical document dates to about 600, 700. It represents the status of the liturgy in Rome in about 650. So
And how did
before
the
that,
Roman collection come about?
we don't know. We don't know. There are many aspects in which we can guess. We can say, for example, that this specific again, going back to the beginning of our conversation, we can say this specific reading was chosen for this occasion because of the interpretation of this passage which Church Father X gives. We can say that this particular reading was chosen for this day because of something about the station where it is. But prior to the 7th century, we only have one other document, which is very much a unique thing. Our records of the earliest liturgical forms are almost nothing.
All right. Well, going back to the relation then of the lectionary and the missal. So you mentioned the lectionary. What would be, let's say, the essential features then that make up the missal, along with the lectionary? I don't know if that's even an
Well,
answerable question.
in terms of I would say it's not that. I mean, traditionally, the church always regarded it's all essential, in the sense that the liturgy has its musical parts,
Mhm.
the introit, the Kyrie, the Gloria, the gradual, which is sung after the epistle. It has its collection of scriptural readings, and then it has what we call the euchology, the collection of prayers. And
Mhm.
so, since these things were always used together, there's no such thing as a liturgy that doesn't have all of these. I wouldn't say that any one of them is essential such that we can identify that.
Yep.
But collectively, what we can say is that every tradition has its own specific features.
Mhm.
There is a specifically Roman collection of readings. There's a
Mhm.
specifically Roman collection of prayers. There's a
Mhm.
specifically Roman collection of chants. The radical discontinuity between the traditional Roman rite and the Novus Ordo lies in the drastic alteration of those things, some of which, as I said, have been, were in their place from as far back as we have records. In some cases, that does stretch into the 7th century, and then in a limited number of cases into the 6th. So.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Well, it's interesting that this breaking apart of this tradition actually happens well in modernity in the 20th century specifically, because it does seem that modernity is afflicted by this urge to break up a unity in its essential constitutive components. But in something where we don't really understand the origin and even have any historical record for its growth, it's actually impossible to a certain degree. It is possible to study its elements, but the elements can only really be studied in relation to the whole, right? Which is something that I think is actually ubiquitous in theology, right? I mean, even the different books of scripture can only be really studied in view of the whole of the whole of Revelation, and then as Christocentric, so with Christ in mind, with the incarnation in mind. And I feel like here we're before the same kind of thing. We have something that is given to us, right? That's bequeathed to us, that is a unity. But then when we start analyzing the independent parts, we need to be extra careful not to separate those parts from the unity that gives them life. And once we separate them, then they're broken apart, and then the whole falls apart. And I feel very much that is a mind, a change of mind, and a paradigm shift maybe, but certainly a change of mind from the old liturgy to the new liturgy, because the old liturgy had more the idea of, well, we want to participate, right, on every level, on every local level. We want to participate liturgically in the papal liturgy, that is the one liturgy, whereas the new rite has always we make the private mass of the priest basically the crux of liturgy, and then everything else is an addition. So we have this core, but then we add stuff on, but then also that treats everything that is added on as an added on feature. So, oh yeah, we can do incense. Oh, we can do no incense. Oh, we do candles. Oh, we don't do candles, right? Whereas the traditional way of looking at the liturgy is looking at it at its unity, and then saying, I mean, can we leave something out? Well, maybe, right? I don't know. What's your opinion?
No, I agree with that assessment entirely. That it was that the new liturgy was created professedly as a de-Romanization of the Roman rite. Mm-hmm. All of the distinctively Roman features of it were taken out or altered in some way. The ones that remain are, like I said, altered. They're in many ways denatured. And it was professedly designed around this idea of inculturation. But what that effectively meant was not that the culture would come to the service of the liturgy, but that the liturgy would go to the service of the culture. The result has been catastrophic. So, I mean, you and I both know from living in Rome, there are few dioceses in the world where the liturgy is celebrated more atrociously than in Rome. I mean, appalling music. Absolutely appalling. And I mean, a repertoire of 4 hymns. So, I mean, no, and what is worse is that, you know, part of what comes along with this is this sort of culture, if I may, in which any priest who tried to remedy that would be severely punished. So that if any Italian priest, almost basically the entire country, but especially in Rome, tried to do the liturgy really beautifully, the way they do it at, for example, Brompton Oratory,
right,
there would be a forcible intervention to stop him from doing that. So, and again, all of this is radically contrary to what the Second Vatican Council asked for.
Well, why do you think that is? Why do you think that is? Is that just because of personal animosity, or like?
I think that there is there is this generation. Well, okay, so this is the thing which I wrote very shortly after Traditionis Custodes came out. What we are essentially looking at is, I mean, the Roman Catholic Church today is a post-revolutionary society, very much like France in, say, 1795 or Russia in 1920, where you've had a revolution. The revolutionaries assured us that their revolution was going to make everything better, and it made everything worse. So when you get to that point, you have 2 choices. One is you can sort of look honestly at the disaster that you've created and ask yourself the honest question, what can I do to fix this? The question that you should be asking yourself first, of course, is, given that I created the disaster, should I be allowed to fix it? So, but politics is what it is. So the other course that you can take, which is, of course, and that's the hard road. The hard road is to honestly assess, gosh, this just didn't work.
Yeah.
The hard road, that's the hard road. The easy road is to say, oh, look, the revolution failed. The revolution has problems. Things aren't going well. But it's not because the principles of the revolution were bad. It's because of those reactions. The reactionaries are subverting the revolution. So if we just get rid of the reactionaries, everything will be well. So that, you know, the predictably catastrophic economic policies of Russia in the 30s, Venezuela today. No, it's not the policies. It's because of all the reactionaries. Go out and, I mean, of course, in the more extreme version, you kill them. So, whereas, and with the current situation with Traditionis Custodes, that's exactly what we have. and this has been part of a sustained propaganda campaign for 60 years, that the reason why the revolution failed, the reason why all of the reforms introduced in the wake of the Second Vatican Council did not bring about the new Pentecost, isn't because the principles of that revolution were themselves faulty. It's because of those wicked subversives. So, and what's interesting is now you'll see this will happen. All right, no one is immortal. Pope Francis is going to die. This is simply the condition of being human. They are going to do to Pope Francis exactly what they did to John Paul II and Benedict. Is that when he is dead, they are going to cast him as one of those people who just didn't have the courage to institute the revolution the way it was really supposed to be instituted. And if we can only get that done, everything will be well. So that is exactly what is going to happen. It's already happening in a very, very small scale. But when he dies, he is going to join Benedict XVI and John Paul II in that illustrious company of those popes who just didn't have the courage to really Vatican II hard.
It's exactly the same dynamic and dynamism than like a utopian rhetoric of the Marxists, which is it's always projecting something positive in the future that is essentially unattainable for one reason or another. And then because it is unattainable, in the time between the now and the future moment, the ones that are made responsible for the failing are the, whatever term may be used, right? The conservatives or the reactionaries or the subversive groups or those, Neo-Pelagians or whatever Francis called, or the rigid, right? The rigid. So it's really fascinating. Yeah, it's fascinating how one can see parallels. Sociological parallels, anyways, in these different dimensions of human existence. I have one. What's left really to see is what should a Catholic do now? So what should a Catholic do in this moment, right? Especially those that want to adhere to this timeless form of the liturgy. What would you advise them to do? Maybe even what would have been some, coping mechanisms that you have developed yourself? I don't know. Could you give some counsel?
Sure. Okay. First, read my blog. No.
Is it published?
I would. Yes. Sorry. What?
Is it published?
What?
Your book.
My blog. Book is in process.
All right. Because you were working on a book, so and I like to have it on hand and show it in the camera. So now that when it is published, please do send me a copy, and then I will hold it.
I will, but my book will be something very nerdy that is not related to. There will not be this. I think there is a broad temptation, which is extremely powerful in our era, as I think it is in all eras, that because when you are in the middle of a disaster, it's very tempting to think that the disaster you are in the middle of is somehow uniquely disastrous in the history of the human race. And that's a reasonable thing. It's a natural and human thing. But it is nevertheless something which needs to be fought against. Because, each disaster does have its own unique characteristics. Disasters themselves are not unique. And so, and so I think that the thing to do is to sort of consider the history of the church. That, for example, Pope Gregory the Great preached a sermon in the 6th century when there were all kinds of tremendous political and natural disasters happening, which he said, look, this is what the Bible says about the signs of the end of the world. Basically, all of these things are happening, so clearly the end of the world is clear. Well, we've been reading this as part of the breviary for 14th century for good reason, as a reminder that there's always that temptation. But in the history of the church, there have been long periods of decadence. In ways that are so alien to our experience that when you explain them to people, they're absolutely astonished by them. So we had a pope once called Paul III, Paul the Farnese family, who became a cardinal because his sister was Alexander VI's favorite mistress. And when I say favorite mistress, yes, that means among a multiplicity of mistresses. So when this man became pope, his first action as pope practically was to make his grandson, actually one of his grandsons, his own successor in the episcopal see that he had abandoned. The boy was 14 years old. And this was done solely so that the family could draw the revenues attached to that see. A month later, he made a 16-year-old a cardinal. That boy had been a bishop since he was 10. So and yet...
Good times, the good old times.
The good old days, right? And yet, Paul III is the same pope who approved the foundation of the Jesuits, who would then become the shock troops of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. And he was the pope who called the Council of Trent. And in order to call the Council of Trent, which is, this is a sort of, history which is not terribly present to us these days, he had to fight tooth and nail with not just the secular powers, but with many powers within the church to get that council done. And that council wound up undoing all of the sort of deeply rooted vices and decadences that created him as a prelate. So that there is, I think, there's this strong temptation to look at the current situation of the church and despair. But it's just, God always finds a way to reform the church. And when things look their darkest, that is generally when the seeds are being planted for a tremendous reform that brings enormous benefit to the church. So I think that is something which is very important to keep in mind. And for those of us who love the traditional liturgy and recognize its value, I really do think that we must, remember what Pope Benedict said about it, because in the end, Pope Benedict's arguments are true, and they are going to carry the day. I don't know how long it will take, but they are going to carry the day because they are true, and truth always wins.
Maybe as a closing, and this doesn't have to be too drawn out, but maybe can you tell us something liturgical detail about the feast today, the Assumption of Mary, on August 15th, where we're recording. So is there something particular that we can, detect in the liturgy today that maybe you can enlighten us?
Well, the Assumption is probably after the Annunciation, the most painted episode of the Virgin Mary's, the most frequently depicted episode of the Virgin Mary's life, in terms of her feast days. Christmas. So, I think that, so there is there are a number of texts associated with the feast of the Assumption, which refer to flowers in various ways. And you think, oh, flowers for Mary, yeah, that's cute. But there's actually something very, very deep and beautiful connected to that, which is a very, very ancient tradition that when it was time for the Virgin Mary to die, the apostles were all miraculously transported to Jerusalem to be present for her death. And then St. Thomas, late again, isn't there. So the apostles bury her. And there, I should say there's different versions of this. Okay? But one of the version that is so sweet is, so Thomas shows up late again, but where he had doubted the resurrection of Christ, he says to the other guys, guess what? The Virgin Mary has been assumed up into heaven, and I'm going to prove it to you. So he has them bring him to the place where she had been laid to rest. They open up the tomb, and there are flowers growing out of the rock where her body had been. So, and then music starts playing in the sky above. And this has provided the inspiration for an enormous number of truly splendid paintings based on this legend So, I think it's extremely, extremely important when we see how an example of how all of these different things come together. It's extremely important that we preserve that tradition in its fullest. And I think it's extremely important that we, think much more seriously than we thought about it 60 years ago. What does it really? And again, this is so important to the whole work of Joseph Ratzinger. What does it mean for us as a church? What does it mean for us as a Christian people if we renounce that history? What does that mean? And even on a very basic level, what does it mean for our ecumenical relations with our fellow Christians? So the Byzantines accept this tradition. They celebrate it in much more explicit terms than we do. So if we remove all of that symbolism, what are we saying to our ancestors? What are we saying to our fellow Christians of the East? Not just the Orthodox. I mean, ecumenism is great, but I mean to our fellow Catholics. So, and I think it's really important that we, follow that theological lead given to us by Pope Benedict in starting to address these questions. The consequences of not doing so are very, very, very grave and very, very bad.
Well, thank you, Gregory. That's very, very enlightening conversation. I hope that you whet the appetite for our listeners and our audience to delve more into these liturgical questions. So I highly can recommend your blog and the website New Liturgical Movement. We'll also put a link in the description for sure. And then we all await your book with excitement. So thanks for talking to us, for taking the time, and I hope that you will speak again. We continue this conversation off camera and potentially also on camera again sometime in the future. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Very much my pleasure.